During the very early days of World War II, there appeared in the London newspaper, The Guardian, a series of conversations between a wise old tempter named Screwtape and his young apprentice named Wormwood. These conversations were written by C.S. Lewis, a remarkable Christian thinker and writer of the 20th century. Wormwood's sole task is to keep his patient from becoming a faithful and committed follower of Christ. When Screwtape, the wise old mentor, learns that Wormwood's patient has become a Christian, he offers these words of guidance. He says, "One of our great allies at the present is the church itself." Now, Screwtape is not speaking of that great church spread throughout time and in space, grounded in eternity that is invisible to our human eyes. But he's speaking of the church as a gathering place of Christians on this earth. Screwtape advises Wormwood that it will be quite helpful when his patient goes to church to have him concentrate on his neighbors. These are the words he writes. When he gets to his pew and looks around him, he sees just that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors, provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or doubled chins, or odd clothes. The patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind which he supposes to be spiritual, but which in fact is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs. And the mere fact that the other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty to him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. At the present stage, he has no idea of Christian. Quite an interesting observation, don't you think? The church, a powerful weapon in the hand of the tempter or the confuser, to keep men and women like you and me from new life in Jesus Christ. It does make you wonder just exactly what we thought the church was to be, since it is made up of people. People who are hurting, people who are broken, people who are sin-sick, with all kinds of fears and anxieties, at some stage of pride or denial, of healing or recovery or forgiveness. To say the very least, I was quite moved when I read a little piece by Antonio Spadaro, who described the first question he asked Jorge Mario Bergoglio the day he became the Pope, Francis I. Spadaro wrote, "He, Jorge, stands at me in silence. I ask him if I may ask him a question. He nods. I ask, who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He nods and he replies, I do not know what might be the most fitting description. I am a sinner. I don't know what might be the most fitting description. I am a sinner. It seems to me that we try very, very hard to convince ourselves that the church should be more than a congregation of sinners in recovery. Sinners in recovery, striving to put our old selves behind us, seeking to find out how you live this new life of love, embracing the reality that you do have to lose your life in order to save it, coming to grips with God's love and grace and mercy, which have the power to transform us into children of God. We are sinners in recovery, trying to learn how to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, our mind, our soul, and strength. Learning, and sometimes this is the most difficult part, learning to love ourselves and loving our neighbor. We are recovering sinners, seeking to love others as Jesus loves us, seeking to forgive others with the very same forgiveness we have received, working to be compassionate and merciful and understanding to every single person on this earth, because we know God is merciful even to the wicked and the ungrateful. The church is indeed a community of people in recovery. And recovery is rarely immediate and rarely miraculous. It is a challenge before us enabled by God's sustaining grace, which is somehow always sufficient, but never feels like it will be enough. The church is a meeting place of folks in some stage of recovery. With Francis I, no matter how much progress we think we have made, we are still sinners seeking to live like beloved children of God. Because of our misconceptions about what the church is and who we will find there, we are sometimes shocked when a real live sinner enters the doors of our church, repents of his or her sins, and becomes a new person right before our eyes. This happened in a little church I attended as a teenager. Without question, Willie Mathis was the chief sinner of our town. He lived hard. He was mean and he was vicious. He drank heavily. He physically abused his 6 sons, sending them to school with cuts and bruises. He chased women. He kept a mistress. He humiliated his wife, Minnie. As Willie would later confess, I spent 70 years living with the devil. One Sunday, surprising everyone, he showed up at First Baptist Church of Cowpen, South Carolina. All his sin, all his shame, all his guilt came right in behind him, just like mud on his boots. As soon as the invitational hymn began, he bolted to the front, took our pastor's hand, confessed his sins, and surrendered whatever was left of his life to Jesus Christ as his Lord. And surprise, surprise, old sinner Willie Mathis became a faithful follower of Jesus, shaming many of us who had been in the church all of our lives. You see, there was a joy in Willie's heart that escaped most of us. Somehow, mysteriously, miraculously even, the waters of baptism had really washed him clean. Many people were skeptical. They whispered in the drugstore, at the dry cleaners, at the market, and yes, even in the church, that Willie Mathis hadn't really changed, and they knew it. But for the rest of his life, Willie Mathis was a changed man. And one way that he was changed is that every Sunday morning, he was the first person to arrive at church. And he greeted everyone as they entered. And he was the last person to leave only after they locked all the doors. What was he doing? Well, in Willie's words, he had a lot of time to make up. And he was very grateful for Jesus' patience with him. I'm not really sure what we expect the church to be when in the end it is composed of a struggling crew of recovering sinners. Just this week I listened as someone said that people are afraid to come to church. I wished I had asked a question, but I didn't. I wish I had asked, are they afraid to come to this church, or are they afraid to go to any church? But it doesn't matter, because that question led me to Jacob and Esau. If there were ever two brothers crossways in the world, Jacob and Esau were. Regretfully, their parents inspired and contributed to their dysfunction. Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah loved Jacob, and their sibling rivalry became toxic. As you may remember, Jacob steals Esau's birthright by taking advantage of Esau's hunger one day when he had been out hunting, and demands Esau's birthright in exchange for a bowl of his lentil soup. Next, when old Isaac is nearly dead, Rebekah and Jacob deceive the old man who is almost blind, and Jacob receives the blessing due the firstborn son, and that blessing belonged to Esau. Well, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Esau promises to kill Jacob before the old man's body is cold in the grave. And Jacob runs for his life to his mama's family. Jacob is gone a very, very long time. But there comes a day when he wants to go home, but he's afraid to go home. He's afraid to go home because he still fears Esau's anger. But he heads home anyway, followed by this dreadful, fearful feeling in his soul. When he gets close to home, he knows a meeting with Esau is coming. So he sends ahead gifts, hoping to cool Esau's anger that he is convinced has been smoldering for years, ready to ignite the minute he sees his brother. When Jacob hears that Esau is coming with 400 men, he devises a plan to save as much of his family and his wealth as possible. He divides the troop. He sends the maidens and their children first, then Leah and their children next, and then Rachel and Joseph, his most precious, last. So that hopefully someone will survive when his brother Esau takes his revenge. But if you were listening a few moments ago, you remember that Jacob's fear is about to meet Esau's love. Jacob is surprised. Esau runs to him. Jacob is lost in Esau's massive embrace. Esau buries his face in his brother's neck and kisses him. They both begin to weep. Their tears are intermingled. Yet even then, Jacob cannot accept his brother's acceptance. Esau calls Jacob my brother. But Jacob insists upon calling Esau my Lord, and he insists on being Esau's servant. Jacob wants to buy Esau's love and Esau's peace, but Esau will have none of it. And finally, when he can say nothing else, Jacob looks into the face of his brother and he says, Truly, truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. When I read those words, I am convinced that Jacob and Esau were the inspiration for Jesus' story about those two lost sons and that loving father. I'm not sure of all the reasons that people may be afraid to come or to enter into a church, this church or any other. But I am sure their reasons are about probably as mixed as and as unique as the individuals themselves. But perhaps those of us who are here this morning ought to be concerned about what those fearful people experience when they cross the threshold into Immanuel Church. When they come in, do they find people who offer grace, for they know how desperately they need grace themselves? People who offer acceptance, for they know what it is to fear rejection when shame and guilt still cling too closely to us. People who offer love and to know how to love, because we all know that people are longing for, begging for, and sometimes demanding love in a way that makes them challenging to love. Will they find people here who know enough about sin, public and private, personal and secret, to refuse to cast the first stone of judgment? Will they find here people who have experienced Jesus here, among the people here, and who are unashamed to describe themselves as recovering sinners, seeking to live in the fullness of being a son or daughter of God Himself? Today, as Matt and Sarah freely submitted to believers' baptism, they were saying to us, we looked into your faces and we saw something of the face of God. We entered into your presence and you offered us God's love and God's acceptance. And because we glimpsed God in your presence and you offered us your acceptance and your love, we have decided freely and willingly to cast our lot with you. The body of Christ called Immanuel, as they seek to continue on their journey to be committed followers of Christ. Now, all of this today leads me to two conclusions. First, if we, you and I, are not here this morning hoping to experience the love of Jesus that will transform our lives and our living as recovering sinners on our way to being children of God, then all we have done here this morning is a terrible waste of time and energy. Second, if strangers who cross our threshold do not experience in us a reflection of the love of God that dwells in us, then all we have done is a terrible waste of time and energy, and our steeple rises into the sky as a false hope that God may be found among us. For after all, we are not the church. Only the presence and power of Jesus, where 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, makes this place church. This we must remember, or we will lose our souls. So, thanks be to God for a day like today, when we are reminded that someone came in here and someone experienced the love of God in our presence. Someone looked into our faces and caught a glimpse of God. Let us give thanks that we have received that word this day in the baptism we have witnessed. Thanks be